All right. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I've never been to this conference before. It's my first time. I've really enjoyed it so far, covering a lot of ground. A little background on me. Went to college at Long Island University, Southampton College. Graduated in 2000, and Howie Reisman here can tell you that I've been talking about sharks since even before I got to Southampton. He found it pretty annoying at the time, I think, but I've tried to follow through, and I've been very fortunate and had some great research experiences, learned about sharks in different places, and so now I'm kind of bringing it back here to Long Island, which is it's really been rewarding for me. Similar to what Chris Paparo mentioned earlier today, there's been a lot of doom and gloom with environmental stories, particularly with sharks. Sharks have sort of become a poster child for the global overfishing problem, and it's definitely an issue. A lot of shark populations around the world are in fact overfished, and management has been lacking in a lot of places. So we hear a lot of these stories about sharks under threat, sharks nearing extinction, and it is a concern. But today, I'm hoping to share hopefully a little bit happier story. So something that'll make the sharks smile, hopefully make you guys smile too. So just a little overview of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research I've done on white shark abundance trends in the Northwest Atlantic, a bit about their distribution and movements, what we've known previously about that, and then kind of where does Long Island fit in that big picture for white sharks. A couple of years ago now, myself and a number of colleagues, mostly from NOAA, published this paper with what I thought relatively inauspicious title, Seasonal Distribution and Historic Trends and Abundance of White Sharks in the Western North Atlantic. And basically what we did is we compiled all the known records of white sharks along the whole North American coast. And you plot some of these out over time, and make some assumptions about observation effort, and you can estimate their relative abundance trends, not the numbers of sharks, but basically whether their population's been going up or down over time. And so basically we found that prior to the 1960s, there weren't a lot of data, but there wasn't a lot of shark fishing prior to that either. So 1960 sort of became our benchmark for the historical population, and we found that you can see the decline through into the 1990s here, and that was mainly the result of overfishing, not just white sharks, but a lot of shark populations along the U.S. coast. And then since the 1990s, we'll talk a little more detail about it later on, but we've seen the signs of recovery, that the population did decline quite a bit, but it's actually on its way, slowly, gradually increasing. So, of course, when you talk about increasing great white shark populations, it tends to get some media attention. So it started out with kind of more of a local story, Cape Cod shark population bouncing back. I'm like, all right, that's not bad. And then it became surging when it got to the AP. And then thriving, National Geographic, vast increase, jumping, and then booming. None of those terms which were never ever mentioned in our paper about this sort of gradual recovery of white sharks. So eventually that led to me having to go on national television to try to calm these journalists down and to let them know that the shark population is not exploding. You don't have to worry about going in the water. We've gone from a very low number of white sharks to a slightly larger low number of white sharks in general as this recovery is taking place. So basically what we did with this study, again, we compiled all these known records. We got newspaper clippings, historical records, museum collections, fishery reported data, observer records, things like that. And this is the biggest white shark in our database that was actually measured. This is an 18.5-foot shark caught up off Prince Edward Island in 1983. And here's a little more local story. I don't know if any of you guys remember Frank Mundus, the monster man out in Montauk. He caught a number of great white sharks back in the day before when that was still allowed. And so we sort of compiled all these records of white shark catches that we knew about and threw them all together. And we tried to take a holistic view of that. So when you put all of those records on the map, this is basically what you get. And this had been done about 30 years ago. But there's been a lot more data collected since then. So this is sort of an update to some research done by Jack Casey and Wes Pratt from the National Marine Fisheries Service back in the mid-'80s. And so we included all that data, added all this new data on top of it, and you can see that white sharks just generally, broadly range from around Newfoundland, Canada, down to the Caribbean. We even have a few records down here, U.S. Virgin Islands and over to Mexico. But you can see they're generally, most of the records are coming from the Northeast U.S. and also around Florida. And so when we kind of plotted these out by season, and we look at water temperature patterns, we found that the white sharks, for the most part, were occurring in this band of water that's roughly 55 to 75 degrees. And as the water cools off into the winter, the population just shifts southward. And so that 55 to 75 degree water is mostly found off the southeast U.S., particularly around Florida. So with all these dots on the map, we start to tease out these patterns, and you can see that essentially white sharks are snowbirds. They just like us, so they don't like the cold. They want to go south for the winter and stay where it's warm. So what's driving this recovery? This is sort of one of the big questions and something that I work on with my job with National Marine Fisheries Service is fisheries management. It's one of the goals of fisheries management is to help these populations that we know declined. We want to help them recover and be sustainable. And so the Shark Fishery Management Plan, which included white sharks and a number of other species, was first implemented in 1993, and white sharks were actually prohibited from all harvest in 1997. So you can see that that time period kind of coincides with when we start to see this gradual increase in their population. And we hope that's continuing to recover. We don't know exactly where we're headed, but that's just one of the other research questions that we hope to continue to work on in the future. So where do big white sharks come from? A lot of our records were from sort of subadult and adult sharks, big fish. So where do these big fish come from? Well, little fish, of course. This is the smallest white shark in our database. This is the size that white sharks are born. White sharks are born after either a 12 to 18 month gestation period. The females can have up to about 10 pups at a time. And they're born at 4 feet long. They're born bigger than most other fish in the ocean. They're born an apex predator. So this is where the big white sharks come from, the little white sharks. And then where do we find little white sharks? That was the next picture. So we had this great big database. And so we split out all of these young of the year, these sort of newborn size white sharks, and put them on the map. And this is what the map shows. So you can see that we had a couple up in Massachusetts, but the rest of them were all between New Jersey and South Shore, Massachusetts, kind of clustered here off Long Island in the New York Bight. So the stretch between Montauk and coast of New Jersey is generally considered the New York Bight. We have Hudson Canyon here coming out from the city. And you can see that some of these records were really very close to shore. So we had known about this for a long time. Again, these records were compiled over a couple hundred-year period. So this had been reported before by Casey and Pratt. And this was in their 1985 paper about white sharks. And this is from a single long line set off Sandy Hook, New Jersey. In the 1960s, they caught, I think it was four or five of these pups, newborn white sharks, and then a number of juveniles as well. And that was all on a half-mile long line set off Sandy Hook. So they were the first to really suggest that, based on what we've seen across the coast, pretty much all of the small baby white sharks are occurring in this area of the New York Bight. And so maybe it could represent a nursery area for those sharks. So since that time, there's been really very little research. There's some evidence that the sharks are there in a higher concentration, but no one's really taken a hard look at them. So one thing that, when I got to this point in my career, some of the questions I had were like, all right, let's take another look at these baby white sharks. What about their movement patterns in this area? What about their habitat preferences? What about their prey? Basically, why are they here? What is it about this stretch that makes it attractive to these baby white sharks? And can we start catching them again to learn more about them? So, here we go. So this is where electronic tagging comes in, tagging and telemetry. It's something that I've been doing for a very long time. I started it working with Pete Klimley out in California. Some of the folks here know Pete. And learning to tag great white sharks with these tags that help us understand their behavior, their movement patterns, and what kind of habitats they like. And so this is just one example of a pop-up satellite tag. That's one of the types of tags that we put on white sharks and other species to learn about their migrations, their depth and temperature preferences, and their movements. So thankfully we have all these new gadgets. The shark tracking technology has improved a great deal since the mid-1970s, when all there was available was harpoons and barrels. So basically this led a few years ago to what we now are calling the Long Island Shark Collaboration. It's sort of a loose group of friends, basically. It started out with mainly myself and Captain Greg Metzger, who's here. We went to Southampton College together. We love fishing. Greg goes shark fishing, or had been going shark fishing for years. And we reconnected, and he was like, hey, well, rather than just catching these sharks, can we try to do some research? And I said, like, well, let's see if we can catch some of these baby white sharks. So it took a couple years, but in August 2015, after monitoring the radio and getting all kinds of reports from everybody else catching these baby white sharks out off Southampton, Greg was able to go out and get one. And we were able to put a donated pop-up satellite tag on this newborn white shark. So the tag was provided by Molly Luckavage at UMASS Boston. And so this is the first time a young of the year white shark had been tagged with a satellite tag in the Northwest Atlantic. So it was very exciting. And we were hoping to get some good data out of this. And so what we found was basically the tag, after about 45 days, popped off. So it was tagged the end of August, it popped off the first week of October, down off the eastern shore of Maryland. And this is really, we didn't get a lot of data, we didn't get any depth or temperature data out of that tag, but we did get this pop-up location, and it shows that the shark seemed to be heading south for the winter. Something that we maybe kind of expected, but we weren't sure. And so this is the first, the first real indication we have of the movements of these sharks. And that was really just sort of a serendipitous, collection of friends that are trying to put something together, and some out-of-pocket expenses, and we were able to get this done. So with that effort, we caught the attention of the research and education organization OSearch, which is founded by Chris Fisher here. I don't know if any of you folks have seen Chris or heard about OSearch on TV and other places. They do a lot of social media, public outreach, and that kind of thing. And they've had great success in recent years tracking big white sharks along the coast, and other places around the world too, in the West Coast. They've been to Australia and South Africa. And this is just an example of the tracks of 3 of the bigger white sharks that they've tracked. And all the sharks get a name because that has great educational value. So these yellow dots are from Catherine. She's kind of hugging the coast here. The red dots are the shark named Mary Lee, and she kind of went offshore. And these yellow dots are from Lydia. And all these sharks have been, every time they pass by somebody, they're showing up in the local media. So these sharks with these names are getting a lot of media attention. And these satellite tags have really kind of exploded what we thought we knew about white shark distribution and movements. If you recall from my previous map, all the dots were kind of hugging the coast. Well, now we know that some of these sharks, they spend a lot of time offshore. They're going way offshore. Lydia swam up to the Grand Banks, and she was up here in like the fall. It was like October, November, where we thought most of the sharks would be heading south. And she continued to go north and east. This is the first tagged white shark to ever get out to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge region. She was closer to Portugal than she was to the east coast of the U.S. where she was tagged. And this tag has been transmitting now for 4 years, and you can still follow. Lydia's still pinging in. It's a great thing. All these data points are available on the OSearch website, and you can track these sharks in almost real time. When the tag is above the surface, it hits the satellites, it shows up on the website, and you can follow these sharks. And the shark has come back towards the East Coast recently, and is I think somewhere down off Florida, but kind of doing this big loop. So exciting stuff, and we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we could apply that same technology to these baby white sharks? And so that's what we organized. So last August, OSearch offered to come for a couple weeks and basically anchor up off the South Shore of Long Island, and we were going to try to catch a couple of these baby white sharks and see if we could get some tags on them, and then start learning more about their migration patterns like those other big sharks. And so success. We had some success. This is the first one we caught. This shark ended up being named Montauk. And this is a young of the year pup. And here's Captain Metzger here in the background. And the shark was caught and tagged. And when it's on deck, we had multiple science groups on board. We had help from WCS, New York Aquarium staff. and members of the Long Island Shark Collaboration. It was a great group of scientists and friends. We got together out in the boat, and we made this happen, and we collected all kinds of samples. So when you get access to a shark like this, you want to make sure it's taken care of and healthy, first of all. But then we're able to collect samples, fin clips, muscle biopsies, blood samples, parasites, and then plus we tagged it with the satellite tag, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. This sort of conventional NIMS shark tag, which is just a mark recapture tag. If the shark is caught again, it'll have this little tag with a return address on it. We can find out where it went. And we also did surgery on these fish and implanted an acoustic tag, which is picked up by these acoustic receivers that are moored all along the US coast. Excuse me. So it was a great opportunity to have some success and sort of maximize the amount of scientific information we could collect from these little sharks. So here's a more close-up shot of the satellite tag. This is called a spot tag, smart position or temperature transmitter. And it's basically a real-time satellite transmitter. And whenever the shark's fin is above the surface of the water, whenever the switch up here is dry, it'll start transmitting. And then the transmission will be received by Argos satellite system, and then the Argos satellite system basically sends me an email, and I get an email like, hey, your shark pinged here, and it gives you the position. It's amazing. Excuse me. So these tags are bolted on, and the battery life is good for several years. So potentially, if it doesn't get fouled or fall off the fin, we could be able to track these sharks for up to 4 or 5 years. So it started with Montauk, which we were very excited about. It means like the mission was successful. We caught another white shark. We now have 2 satellite tagged white sharks. And then after I left the expedition to go back to work, back to the office, they proceeded to catch 8 more baby white sharks over the next week. And I missed out on all of that. Greg was there for most of it, fortunately. I know Chris was there for some of it. But blew everyone away. We were able to have such success and catch these sharks in bigger numbers than have been observed since the 1960s when Jack Casey was out sampling for these things. So, and we immediately started getting data, which was even greater. So like, all right, so first of all, we knew we could catch some of these sharks and we could get these tags on, but then the shark has to be at the surface. We really knew nothing about the behavior of these animals. Are they going to be at the surface often enough to provide that satellite data? Are they going to swim at the surface and give us those pings that we need? And so we immediately started getting data, which is super exciting. And so these now we're tracking. This is just a sample of some of the other sharks that all got their names. And again, you can still track these guys on the OSearch website right now. They even have an app you can download for your phone. So we started getting this movement data, and this is really the first sort of local scale movement data of young of the year baby white sharks. And so this is after the first month. This is a month after the expedition ended. All of these great movements that we never had before. So you can see that the sharks kind of were mostly in this stretch between Fire Island and Montauk. Out, not right hugging the coast for the most part, but out a little ways. Generally, I think this is 50 to 100 feet of water, roughly. But some were making these forays into deeper water offshore. And some went as far west as like the mouth of the Hudson, and we had no idea really where these sharks would go or how long they'd hang around. And so this is the most recent data we have on all nine of these sharks. So we found that basically from August to October, like through the end of the summer, basically the sharks pretty much all hung out right here off the South Shore of Long Island. Really showing residency to this area, which is sort of the final criteria you need to help define this area as a nursery. We knew the sharks from the previous research, historical data, and the observations. We knew there were a lot of young of the year white sharks here. And we know that they occurred there year after year, but we needed to show that there's some residency to their movements to really say that, all right, this area is a nursery. It's really important to their survival. And so that's what we've shown now. We've got some residency information. The sharks really hanging out close to the South Shore of Long Island through the summer. And then during the fall and into the winter, they started making these southward movements. And you'll see that they're pretty much all along the coast. We weren't sure if these sharks were maybe going to go out into deep water. So far, we haven't seen that. They've all been sort of hugging the coastline on the continental shelf here. And even as the shelf narrows here down near Cape Hatteras, they're still kind of staying on the shelf. And just recently, up till last week when I made this slide, the sharks have been basically off the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We don't have any indication yet that they've gone further south than that. But this is sort of the first indications that this could be sort of overwinter habitat for young of the year white sharks. Again, this is information we didn't have. We knew these sharks occurred in some abundance during the summer months off Long Island, but in the winter, where do they go? Now we have some idea. So why is this information helpful? Why do we need to know about where these sharks are swimming? Well, for me, the main thing is about fisheries interactions. We need to know if they're really vulnerable to bycatch in fisheries. So the data we have, this is from the paper they published a couple years ago, kind of showing where the data comes from with fishing gear interactions. And you see that the black bars here are the young of the year sharks. That's mainly what we're focusing on, the pups. And you see most of them of the pup records came from rod and reel fishing, and a few from long line and gill net, and also trawl. So we know that these, those are mainly, these are commercial gears, long line and gill net and trawl, but recreational fisheries are interacting with quite a few of them. So these understanding these movements and distribution patterns will kind of help tie together where they're vulnerable to being caught by fisheries. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So this is long line. This is fishery dependent. So this is commercial fishing. Long line FI is fishery independent, which means it's basically research surveys that they're being caught on. So the fishery, the commercial fishery catches more of the juveniles, whereas the research survey catch more of the young of the year and a few of the juveniles. Mm-hmm. So we also know that these sharks are they're exposed to or potentially exposed to offshore energy development activities. We don't know, we know they're kind of in the same area. So here we have LNG terminals, we have offshore wind proposal areas. We don't know if these are going to have negative impacts on the sharks, but now we know where the sharks are relative to these developments. We can sort of, we have new information to help assess what those impacts could be on the sharks. We know the sharks occur in these areas. And we can say, how often do they occur in these areas? You can't tell that information without having these telemetry tracks. So it's really going to be insightful to have this movement information. And also coastal habitat degradation. Here's an overhead of Shinnecock with a brown tide bloom. Obviously, so far the sharks aren't occurring in estuaries, but these kind of water quality patterns and coastal development, they're going to affect offshore species as well. They could affect the prey moving in and out of the estuaries, things that sharks might be feeding on. And so there could be these sort of trickle-down effects of coastal habitat degradation. And given that the sharks spend a fair amount of time pretty close to the coast, there could be some susceptibility there that we need to be aware of. So overall, to sort of wrap up the talk, the white shark population is gradually increasing. I said this is a comeback. This is a comeback story. It's a happy story. It's not anything to be freaked out about like the media was initially. This is a sign of conservation success, and it's one of the first examples of a sort of growing trend in shark conservation that the U.S. is really doing a pretty good job, at least in the Atlantic, of managing shark populations and helping them recover from that era of overfishing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So our distribution data show that there's these broad seasonal shifts in distribution, but the New York Bight really appears to be essential habitat for young of the year and juvenile sharks more than any other place along the coast. So it's really the primary source of recruits for the overall white shark population. We've been hearing a lot about the research going on off Massachusetts, off Cape Cod, with the large white sharks attracted to the seal colonies up there, worked by my PhD advisor, Greg Skomel, up there. Those sharks that are there up off the Cape that he's tagging and studying were probably born somewhere off Long Island or spent their first years off Long Island. So further research is needed. We're really just getting started. We want to learn more about their movement, habitat, and prey preferences. and again, the potential impacts of these human activities on the young of the year and juvenile sharks. So, like I said, we're just scratching the surface. We're really just getting started. It's been kind of a really unexpected and awesome experience to be in a position for all this to sort of come together somewhat serendipitously. It was just started out with some friends talking while they were fishing, and now it's sort of become this great new research project, and we certainly hope we got many years of work ahead of us. There's no shortage of questions on these little white sharks, and OSearch expects to come back again this year, and maybe hopefully we can tag another 9 or 10 of these guys and sort of help. You get enough sample size, and you can really sort of close the book on certain questions. You get enough of these fish tagged. So we're very excited about what we've accomplished so far, but we're really looking forward to where we're headed in the coming years too. Again, this is not just me. This is a lot of people helping to get where we've gotten to so far. So I really need to thank Greg Metzger. He's our man on the water, making this all happen. He's at Southampton High School in Real Science Charters. Greg Skolmo's been a great supporter up in Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. Molly Lukavich and Tim Lamb at UMass Boston. South Fork Natural History Museum. Thanks to Frank, it was great to finally meet you. Jess Quinlan and Chris Raparo, they've been awesome in the field and supporting everything. And then all the OSearch folks. Last year, like I said, we were far more successful than any of us expected. We were hoping to get maybe a couple. I think we would have been very happy with one. Like, if we got more than one, we were going to be super psyched. But to come away with 9 sharks tagged was fantastic. So thanks to that whole crew and the collaborators that helped with that expedition last year. We hope that we can keep them involved in the coming years too. We have permits to cover all this work. And of course, there's support from a number of volunteers and private donors as well to help contribute to this work. So with that, I had to give my son a little cameo here, but here he is with a juvenile white shark jaw. And with that, I'll happy to have a few minutes, I think, for questions. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Just to note, the LNG terminal off of Long Beach, Long Island, was killed by Governor Cuomo. It's dead.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you use the mic, the aisle mic.
All right. The points that you were mentioning, there seems to be the Cape Cod, the Gulf Stream, and the Hudson River all seem to be locations of moving water close to the shoreline. Would there be any connection between the 3 of these points and the number of white shark sightings?
Sorry, you're referring to sort of just the water, like the currents and
The currents.
It's possible, but I think generally with sharks, their distributions are generally governed by temperature and the availability of food. So they're going to be looking for a comfortable temperature. With the case of white sharks, it's generally like 60 to 75 degrees or so. And then their preferred prey. So with the larger white sharks, they prefer to feed on seals and mammals, the bigger prey. So the bigger white sharks tend to be clustered off the Cape because that's where all the seals are. And I think the smaller white sharks, they don't feed on mammals. They're not big enough yet, so they're feeding on a variety of fish and squid and other things. There's abundant prey. As we saw from Chris's talk, there's dozens of species of potential food for them to choose from off the South Shore of Long Island. So I think the currents play a role in the ecosystem overall in producing that prey, but I think the sharks are really there because of the food and the water temperature.
Thank you.
Hi, good presentation. Any explanation, I realize it's probably partly food-based, but is there any explanation when you showed that one graph of that one shark migration, she was going all over the place, way out, you said she was closer to Portugal than to the United States, Lydia?
Yeah, here we go.
Any ideas why that one is just gone so crazy, whereas the others are more hugging the coast?
Yeah, the short answer is we really don't know. We don't understand what drives the individual decisions of these sharks. They're certainly they're big fish. They're certainly capable of making these big movements. But why would Lydia go to these places? There's no seals out like on the Grand Banks. Well, I mean, there's Sable Island. So actually, That's one of the things. You think, when you look at these tracks, try to think about food. Like, they have to be feeding somewhere along this track, so what could be there that they're feeding on? Here, off the Grand Banks is Sable Island, which is actually the largest seal colony in the North Atlantic. There's like tens of thousands of seals up there. So that could be part of the reason the shark Lydia hung out in here, but there's certainly no seals out here over the Mid-Atlantic Ridge as far as we know. And so the other thing to keep in mind is you have the Gulf Stream kind of coming up this way, going across. And so even though this seems pretty far north, the Gulf Stream is keeping these waters relatively warm, comfortable enough for a big white shark. And there's a lot of things that occur in the Gulf Stream. There's tuna and mackerels and mahi, all kinds of potential food, fish food. There could be squid and other things down deep too. So, but we don't know really what drives this overall cycle. We'd like to think Lydia was a big female. It's possible she was gravid, carrying pups. And with these big, sort of adult, mature female white sharks, we think some of this loop could have to do with the reproductive cycle and kind of staying in warm water. And then, where do they? These pups first arrive off New York in June, July, and so we think that pupping occurs maybe in June, July, somewhere nearby. We don't know if it's exactly off New York. It could be offshore and the sharks move in, or the sharks could really come in right off Long Island and drop the pups. We don't really know that yet, where the birthing takes place, but. Part of this cycle could be tied to things like that, where she's pupping, and then also avoiding potential injurious interactions from other white sharks. Male white sharks can cause damage to the female white sharks, and so I think part of the thought about some of these big loops of the big females could be to sort of get away from the rest of the larger white shark population, avoid interactions with others of their kind, and keep the pups safe while they're developing. Oh, yeah, so this is multiple years. I forget when these sharks were tagged. I want to say, yeah, so I think some of these sharks were tagged in 2011 and 12. I think, and then this is probably 2 years roughly worth of data.
I'd be curious in what your goal is for the numbers. Are you looking to increase them tremendously? Are you at where you think it's a sustainable number? What are we looking at?
Yeah, as far as the research and these particular satellite tags, generally for some statistical power, you want to get at least 20. So that's sort of a minimum number to shoot for, is getting these particular tags on 20 fish. And that will hopefully show enough variability in individual movements so you get an idea of what the whole population is doing. So you sort of subsample. You don't need to tag every fish in the population, but you want to tag enough that they're representative of the whole population. So 20 is our initial sort of target threshold with these spot tags, with the dorsal fin tags. And we want to you want to get just enough, but try to minimize the damage, because those tags do result in some injury to the sharks. They'll eventually fall off, and the sharks are so far surviving just fine, but does leave them with some scars and things. So we want to minimize those impacts on the sharks that are out there.
Okay.
So all right, thanks.
Tobey, thank you.